present a few scattered ideas around the third part of November, which originates from the fact that Andrea Wolf is now more missing than ever. Why is that? Because actually the location of her grave has been disclosed, it has been found, or basically people always knew where it was, but it has become public, and I also went there, but it is as impossible as ever to recover her body, to identify her bones, to find out what really happened, because nobody cares. There is no legal case around it, and this grave cannot be opened, it cannot be touched. It just remains as it was for 13 years up in the mountains in relative solitude. So this lecture, or actually these ideas around the script for a certain part of the film, try to focus on the idea of missing itself. What is a missing person? What is the status of a missing person? And you have already seen in November me conjuring up Bruce Lee's spirit and saying that there are certain people who are at the same time dead and alive. Because, it's unclear how they died. They just disappeared, they went missing, they were kidnapped. Or maybe they went underground, who knows? Like Elvis and Bruce Lee and Andrea Wolf and so many, like tens of thousands of people who went missing in the 20th century, or more millions. All of them are somehow in that paradoxical state where we don't know whether they are dead or alive. Technically, they could come any day, they could knock at our door. It happened so many times also that people came back from death, literally. But in this case, it didn't happen and probably won't happen, but still, she's in that state of limbo. She's in a state where we cannot confirm that she's dead, and we know she's not alive either. So what is this state of missing? So let me start with something else, which is a very eccentric mental image, thought image, which was imagined by an Austrian quantum physicist called Erwin Schrödinger back in 1935. And Schrödinger set up a completely mean and insidious thought experiment. He imagined a box, and inside that box there would be a cat put in there. It was alive at the time it was put into that box. And then there would be a flask containing radioactive material, and in it there would be a particle decaying from that radioactive matter with a probability of 50% over the next hour. And if it did, if the particle decayed, then some poison gas would be released and the poor cat would die. Which leads actually to this situation. So there is a box, there is a radioactive material in there, there is poison gas which is potentially set free, but we don't exactly know. And after 1 hour, the probability that the particle has decayed and the cat is dead is exactly 50%. Now the interesting thing is you could say, okay, we open the box after 1 hour and then the cat is either dead or alive, but this is not what Schrödinger was exactly how he exactly imagined the situation, because for him it was much more, let's say, complex than that. Because what happened actually while the box was closed, and that's interesting, because Schrödinger imagined that actually during the time the box was closed, there were actually 2 cats in the box, not one which was either dead or alive, but 1 dead cat and 1 live cat. And they were sort of superimposing onto each other. So, like this. So during the time when the box was closed, this would be the actual state of the cat. It would be dead as well as alive at the same time. This is quantum physics. I mean, one could explain it, but it would take too long. Anyhow, this is not some sort of fantasy. From the point of view of quantum physics, this is material reality, meaning during that hour there are 2 cats, one is dead, one is alive, and only when the box is open is a decision being made whether the cat is actually dead or alive. And this decision is being made actually because somebody is looking at it. It is the observer which sort of tilts the situation and sort of provokes a decision whether the cat has actually been dead or alive inside the box during that time. So what happens is actually what is produced is a so-called state of indeterminacy and a state of superposition. Two states are being superimposed onto each other, one dead state and one live state. And this creates a so-called state of indeterminacy. You cannot really decide what happens unless you get an observer, somebody who really looks at the box, and this observer is actually the person that will, kings and also queens actually had two bodies. One was mortal, was born, was, had illnesses, was foolish, and was going to die. It was mortal. But the other one was completely immortal. This was the realm, if you like, or the part of the king that could never die. That simply when the natural body of the king died would be passed on to the next king. Then he would, take on, or she would take on that immortal part of the kingdom. And you can say that this is something which has absolutely no relevance today, but I would completely contest that. I think that the idea of the two bodies of the king is perfectly alive nowadays in popular culture, looking at that king here who had many bodies, also many double bodies, and of whom we do not know exactly whether he is alive or dead, and many people say that he is in fact still alive, and there's also a second double king, which is his king, the king of Pop, which actually had even more bodies, and who is actually in a very strange genealogical way, dynastically related to the first king. And also this king, we don't exactly, we know he's dead, but there is many conspiracy theories saying that he went underground, all that story about Bruce Lee from November is sort of repeating in these figures from whom we do not exactly know whether they are dead or whether they are alive. And these are the two bodies of the king nowadays. The two bodies of the king was the figure over which the idea, the concept of sovereignty was established. And this is interesting in relation to this idea of Schrödinger's cat again, because what Schrödinger didn't know and what he didn't realize and what he didn't count on was that his experiment was actually realized in the political sphere in the 20th century big time. Using radioactive substances or poison gas to kill people inside boxes and then pretending that one didn't know whether they were dead or alive, that became, let's say, a standard tool of rule in the 20th century. So the interesting thing is that Schrödinger even mentioned the name of the poison gas which was supposed to kill the cat, which was hydrocyanic acid, and he really put it down in his thought experiment. Hydrocyanic acid was used only 4 years later in Poland to kill disabled people. Nazis used that as a poison gas in an experimental gas chamber, and later when it had passed, the stage of experimentation was produced industrially as Zyklon B and applied all over gas chambers in Nazi concentration camps. In that respect, it is quite paradoxical and also ironical that one of the main war criminals from that period was used as, let's say, or became a paradigmatic figure when it came to identifying dead or missing people. And Eyal will talk a lot about this tomorrow, so I'm going to run through this very, very briefly. He will give you the details of this tomorrow. But I'm talking about Josef Mengele, who was, of course, a concentration camp so-called doctor in Auschwitz, performed many medical experiments there, and then went into hiding in Argentina, and then later drowned in Brazil, was buried there without ever being brought to justice. Now his skull, or the identification of his body, became a sort of stepping stone in order to establish forensic technologies in order to identify, you know, unidentified people, hosts' bodies, who didn't have a name, who you didn't know who they were. And one of the main technologies actually also bears the name really of superposition, but in a completely different sense. What do they mean? They do not mean like quantum states being superimposed onto each other, but it is about video superposition. Two video images were superimposed on top of each other. A video image of the live Mengele on the one hand, and an image of his skull on the other hand. And then those two were matched in order to see if they fitted, so to speak, on top of each other. And it was really complicated to do this. I mean, nowadays it seems very surprising that it could ever have been that complicated, but it was a major stepping stone in the development of forensic technologies and methodologies of identification. And the interesting thing is that this methodology doesn't work, basically. I mean, it doesn't work to produce positive results. It just works to say, well, this skull does not match this face. And you can establish a certain rate of probability in trying to identify someone, but it does never give any sort of positive result. It just serves to establish probability which reaches behind the threshold of scientific doubt. And thus, interestingly, what should be an identification of somebody, a missing person, in this case Josef Mengele, war criminal, becomes a sort of identification, because in a way the face and the skull, the skin and the bone never match perfectly. They don't in representation. You can maybe do something with DNA, which is much better than that. But if you work with images, there's always a gap. There's always something missing. There's always this slight gap between the skin, between the face and the skull, which provides for possible mistakes and misidentification, and thus the identification becomes what I would call rather an identification produced by this other state of superposition. Okay. 10 minutes to get through one single line here in the paper. Okay. Yes, probability. Probability is also the crucial difference between what Schrödinger imagined for his cat and what I described for the 20th century experiments with, weapons of mass exterminations. Let's put it like that. Because in Schrödinger's experiment, the probability that the cat would be either dead or alive would be 50-50. The cat had a pretty good chance of making it. But in the political experiments with sovereignty, this probability totally dropped, to absolute lows. I don't think anybody has ever calculated how many people emerged from these boxes alive, but I think the chance is that the probability is in the lower 1% range. And so this is one of the sites, which has become a sort of new Schrödinger's cave. I call it Schrödinger's cave. This is the cave where actually the battle took place, which you have heard about in November, the battle where helicopters came in and shot at, this group of insurgents, PKK insurgents, and killed most of them in the battle, and then dragging out the surviving ones to summarily execute them. So this cave actually really does exist. It is littered with human bones and ammunition and rags and